I'm just giving some personal background to get into this topic. I grew up in a very small and conservative country town in Western Australia. And, you know, they're conservative, traditional communities. Practicality was the order of the day. Sometimes I think with farmers, you know, you could give them a pair of pliers and some wire, and they could just about fix anything. You know, they can fix a harvester that's broken down or whatever. And I still have images of being in the shearing sheds and the shearers and a shearer drinking a hot bottle of beer and, you know, was shearing 100 sheep a day or whatever. But something happened when I was maybe 10 or 11 at school. A new teacher came along. In those days, they'd send teachers from the city into the country for a couple of years before they, you know, took up their appointments in the city. His name was Rick McKellar, and I hadn't really met anyone like him before. He was, well, he was educated and, you know, like I suppose like a liberal in a way, and he was right into the 60s. He was like an educated hippie, really. And anyway, what he used to do was, in our so-called English sessions, he would bring in 60s albums, you know, bring in a Beatles album or a Rolling Stones album or whatever had just been coming out, and he'd play them, and then he'd open up for discussion. And it was exciting. I found it exciting. And sometimes I think, you know, how much was going in by osmosis, you know, that incredible creative explosion of the 60s and how it was going in. And it really kind of turned me on to the 60s as a young person. And then later, I went off to boarding school and we moved to the city, and I moved into the back garage, and, you know, we stumbled across weed. And so what used to happen was friends from school would drop in. These became known as the garage sessions over time, and we'd smoke some weed and listen to albums, to 60s music. And it was like we were trying to get to the, you know, we held long and very meandering conversations on 60s philosophy, on the main albums and the main artists, you know. And it was kind of like Bob Dylan was a genius. We thought Bob Dylan was a genius. And, you know, Crosby, Stills and Nash and Young sounded like the 60s. You know, there were different kinds of friends that dropped in. I had one friend called H, and he was like an aficionado of every 60s album that had ever been made. He could tell you, you know, all of the albums and the songs and whatever. And Kim was a friend who, I don't know, looking back on it now, he was like he wanted to be a writer, and he was like a romantic. Even at a young age, he wanted to become a writer, and he'd read Camus, and he'd already read some of the French writers. And, you know, of course, there was other you know, friends that were far more interested in where the weed was growing and what kind of strain it was and on what side of the hill and the paraphernalia of weed. I think, you know, like how to expertly roll a number, that kind of thing. That was very important. But, you know, we listened to the albums and again, it was all going in, and I'd moved in a couple of massive matte black speakers into the back garage, and there were bean bags strewn all over the place so that we could hold our conversations. And I had the beginnings of a countercultural library, you know, 1984 from George Orwell and Brave New World from Huxley. They were kind of the required reading. And then there was To Have or To Be from Erich Fromm. And it was kind of like we were rabid anti-materialists, I think, you know, looking back, what did you need? You know, like you needed a surfboard and a wetsuit, maybe some board shorts. What else? What else did you really need? And you know, maybe you had to save up for a comedy van, and I got well, it was a Comer van that I got actually, and we used to sometimes go off surfing down in the south of Australia, and we had, you know, it all fixed out, so that 3 or 4 people could sleep over, and we could go down into the isolated places and surf and all that kind of stuff. And Bob Dylan was like, we thought, like, in a way, the secrets of 60s philosophy was hidden in his lyrics. You know, I'm talking about some of the, you know, in a way, like when you get swept away by a period of time or caught in that period of time. It's like there was a new spirit of the times, and Bob Dylan was like some mercurial messenger or, you know, a prophetic voice, you know, and the old road is aging, he said, which was kind of like whatever had been true in the 1950s was no longer true in the 60s. And I remember in the Chimes of Freedom, there was like, you know, the sky was like a wild cathedral, and there was thunder and lightning, you know, and it was kind of like that thunder and lightning, you know, it was changing the situation. It was altering the universe. It was changing the cosmological situation, and the sky was cracking its poems and in naked wonder, you know. And sometimes I've thought it was like in the 60s, that was like the 60s version of the Revelations was that the sky was cracking its poems, and then some of those poems were falling down to earth into the 60s artists, musicians, and poets. And that was kind of like that version of for the youth. That was the 60s revelations. And later on, you know, as I got older, I started to look back on that time. And the 60s kind of, I would say, went into my blood. And I started to look at it from, you know, Jung and Hillman, from an archetypal perspective, from a depth psychology perspective. And one of the books I had was Senex and Puer by Hillman. And in the foreword to that book, the foreword is written by Glen Slater from Pacifica. He says, Jung and Hillman used the Latin terms Senex and Puer for old man and youth. They personify the poles of tradition, stasis, structure, and authority on one side, and immediacy, wandering, invention, and idealism on the other. The Senex consolidates and grounds and disciplines. The Puer flashes with insight and thrives on fantasy and creativity. And that reminds me of the 60s. You know, it's in some ways, it was like a clash between the Senex and the Puer, between the old man and the youth. And they're two very different ways of seeing the world and apprehending the world. It was like, well, first off, it was there in Bob Dylan, in the times they are changing. And it's incredible, really, if you look at the album cover of Bob Dylan, The Times They Are Changing, he was 18 when he wrote that. So it's kind of like this boy kind of burst onto the scene, 18-year-old. And he wrote The Times They Are Changing. And he said he was carrying the spirit of the times, let's say. And he said, come senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Don't block up the hallways, or don't stand in the hallways or block up the doors. It's kind of like, don't stand in the way of the new spirit of the times. And it's kind of like the 60s youth. They thought they had a nose for the telltale signs of the Senex, the rigid conservatism, the authoritarianism, the authority that could never be challenged. You know, it was like that, the old, the fixed ideas. And to the 60s youth, to the Puer youth, there was that kind of new imagination. They were carrying this new spirit of the times, and they were on to the new imagination. But for the old man, you know, in the clash of the 60s between the old man and the youth, the old man was like, I remember in the country town where I was, the reaction to the 60s youth. I saw one thing once in the US where it had people in the US, and someone had a sign, send those hippies north to Canada. Like, there was a strong reaction against this so-called 60s uprising, and for the old man, it's like he'd heard about the sympathy with the devil from the Rolling Stones, and he'd heard about the Summer of Love. And, basically the long-haired 60s youth, they should forget about the Jimi Hendrix experience and just kind of cut their hair and get a real job. So there was these two very different ways of apprehending the time. And there were other people, like one person that had a big influence on me. There was Bob Dylan, of course, and then there was the Jimi Hendrix experience. And Jimi Hendrix, in a way, was like the archetypal Puer. Hillman says the Puer wants to turn everything into spirit or make everything new. And it's like Jimi Hendrix, started the electric church, which was like, that was for the youth that wanted to go over into the holy other world of the spirit. Jimi Hendrix was like kind of Icarus, who wanted to fly towards the sun, or he was like Euphorion, who was flying upwards towards the sky. He was, like he said, "Excuse me while I kiss the sky." It's like there was that, that spirit urge. And, that's another thing Hillman said, that the Puer is like an archetype of the spirit. The winged youth is that is that depiction, that symbol of the winged youth who wants to fly, really. And then, but there were lots of people. I was very taken by Timothy Leary, The Politics of Ecstasy, and Timothy Leary was like the high priest of the Puers, in a way, you could say. Tune out, turn off, and turn on to the new. It was kind of like forget the past, turn on to the new imagination. And it makes an important point about Puer, is that you often think of it as the pure imagination as having to do with the youth. But it's Timothy Leary was a Harvard professor. He was well over middle age when all that was happening. But he in a way embodied that Puer imagination as well, because it was about, in a way, the old and the new is the simplest way to see it. And he was the evangelist of the new. He was the high priest of the new. And then there was these, not only psychedelics, but that interest in Eastern and new ways of seeing things. And the other was Joni Mitchell, who was like maybe the Puella of the 60s, our favorite Puella. She, in the song, by the time we got to Woodstock, she was like, we have to get back to the garden. That it wasn't just a music festival, but it was a time, it was like the Kairos, the time of great change. And the 60s youth had all met together for this time of great change. So there was kind of like all these Puer figures, like, Bob Marley, all he ever had were songs of freedom. It's kind of like that was what the Puer had, songs of freedom. But then, since reading Jung and Hillman, and there's the conversation that's been happening in psychology for some time about the Puer. And the first person that maybe really took it up was Marie-Louise von Franz. And she based her book on The Little Prince, and maybe there was a view of the Puer that they kind of like, they haven't grown up. Even Jung said, when that which has wings can touch the earth, there's something about the Puer is like a little like Icarus, who wants to fly towards the sun, but has his wings burnt and crashes into the ocean. And by the way, you could see that happened to quite a few people in the 60s who, sometimes didn't make it past 28. you know. So there's that kind of innocence or naivety or over idealism or over optimism of the Puer, a kind of recklessness, you know. And Marie-Louise von France, you know, as much as I like her, like I really like her books. In fact, I have one just behind me there, Alchemy, the green one. So I like her, but I would say she was pretty strict on the Puer. And there is a bit of a side story to all this, because James Hillman started writing about the Puer and the Senex in 1968, when, you know, a lot of this stuff was at its kind of peak, you know, this clash between the Senex and the Puer. And he had his own backstory. If you read Dick Russell's biography on the life and ideas of James Hillman, that in Zurich, you know, Hillman was, what's the word? He had those pure tendencies in a way, you know, like there was the old guard in Zurich, and Hillman perhaps had some of those pure tendencies. And after Jung died, him and Lopez Pedraza and Pat Berry, they were looking at things in a different way. And I think, you know, maybe that sometimes upset the old guard a little. So Hillman, I don't, you know, and I think Dick Russell rather, says this, that, you know, Hillman was listening to this stuff about the Puer, and because probably was a bit of a Puer himself, with that kind of daring vision or new vision, he didn't like it that much. So he started to reappraise or revision or reimagine the topic. And he, in a way, you know, Hillman said, like, without the vision of the Puer, without that kind of daring, you know, there'll be nothing grand. And that was his kind of take on it. So I would say, you know, with myself, like, I've had a long time to think about the 60s now. And I would say there's a couple of things. Firstly, that, you know, I'll always love it, because having come from that conservative country town, it was like a breath of fresh air. It was exciting. It gave hope. You know, it's like, you know, it's a funny thing if you're a bit of a dreamer and you were brought up in that practical conservative country environment, you know, to hear John Lennon say, you know, you know, you may be a dreamer, we may be dreamers, but we're not the only ones. That there were sort of many having that kind of experience. Like, for a start, that was an important thing. So I'll always love the 60s. And one other thing is that's so interesting is that, you know, now when you look at it, like, there was such a strong reaction against the youth, you know, the Puer youth. And now Bob Dylan has the Nobel Prize for literature, and there's Sir Paul McCartney and Sir Ray Davies from the Kinks. And, you know, it's almost like the establishment is falling over backwards to honour the Puer. So they must have brought some contribution to society. And, you know, everyone loves Keith Richards now. Like, who is loved more than Keith Richards? That's what I sometimes think. He's one of them. He seems like he's one of the most, like, you know, they have that thing on Facebook. what we need to do is start thinking what kind of world we want to leave for Keith Richards. Because after all of us die, he'll still be around. So, you know, the 60s youth did bring a new spirit at the times, and it's mostly seen as a blossoming. But I think there's a few things. You know, on a kind of a personal level, it's like, I think in one way it's been a relief to lose some of the naivety and the innocence and the over optimism and the over idealism, you know, of the youth. You know, I found that, and to get a foot on the ground, as Jung says. And the thing that Hillman often says is that for the Puer, it's like, for the youth, for the Puer youth, you know, it's like the deepening, you know, it's like the growing down, the spirit that loves the heights, but the soul loves the depth. And there's kind of maybe, so it's not to moralize about the, you know, nefarious adolescence of the youth, but to see that, you know, this thing of deepening into the psyche or the soul, it can actually bring more substance and depth to the Puer. So there's the whole thing of undergoing maybe that kind of deepening. And you notice Hillman doesn't say growing up in that old sense of, you know, you should just kind of get rid of all those childish things and grow up. He talks about a growing down into the psyche, and I've always liked that and appreciated that. And the other thing is, I think with the 60s youth, you know, they were experts on the negative side of the old man. And one thing Hillman says is the need to find some rapprochement, some, you know, some rapprochement with the old man. And there's something in all of that, in the sense that they were experts at seeing the negative side, the conservatism, the kind of authoritarianism and that, but they weren't so good on seeing some of the positive aspects of the old man. Like in the story of Icarus, you know, Daedalus counsels Icarus to take a middle way. Like he doesn't say not to fly towards the sun, but he kind of, you know, counsels him to take a middle way. And it's kind of like, the thing about the Senex and the Puer is that they both have positive and negative sides. It's like the positive side of the Senex is the mentor, is the elder, is the wise old man. So there's that positive side, and then the negative side of the Puer, which they're not always good at recognizing, is, you know, the perhaps the ungroundedness or the untetheredness or the unearthed nature of it. So they both have their positive and negative side. And I think the thing is, it's you know, it's a complicated topic. Like the whole area of Senex and Puer is kind of, I think Hillman said once, you know, whichever way you approach it, sometimes you can get burnt, because you can go too far towards the Senex, or you can go too far towards the Puer. It's kind of like, it's not an easy area to approach. But what he advocates is kind of like that we need a kind of a Senex, a Puer within ourselves, a combination of both, you know, an unusual combination of both. So like a consolidated, in my language, a consolidation and a grounding and the adventurous free spirit of the youth. So it's not that one just reverts into the Senex as one gets older, but it's that within us. And I think Hillman said, you know, the soul is not young or old, it's both. So it's kind of like there's the old man and the youth that live in the house of the psyche or the boarding house of the psyche, but there's room for them both, you know? And I think that's where it's, for me, it's a little bit different from what I would call a really traditional Jungian approach that some people have, where they kind of reject the Puer and its immaturity, and it's, or they see it as immature in any case. But it's not a rejection of the youth. That in some way, it's how to carry that adventurous free spirit with us as we get older. And I think there's one other thing that is important is, you know, if you see Peter Kingsley and Murray Stein talking about Jung and the Red Book, one of the big things about the Red Book is that the new often comes from the very old in Jung, you know, the ancestors, the voices of the ancestors. And it's kind of like there needs to be a link between the poor youth who sometimes is ahistorical, that just wants everything to be new, that just wants there to be progress. But the very old is often the seed of the new. And, you know, when Jung said something about the tree, you know, the tree can only grow high as the root structure has gone down. And the root structure, in a way, is the ancestors, the wise old man or woman, the 2 million year old man or 2 million year old woman, the very old, which is at the core of our culture.